Imagine this: a crime so horrific, so haunting it sent shockwaves across a small community. A young couple full of life ripped away in a senseless act of violence. And at the center of it all, an 18-year-old boy, Brandon Bernard. But this story doesn't end there. No, it unfolds over 2 decades, leading to a decision that would divide a nation. On December 10, 2020, Bernard was executed by lethal injection at the age of 40 for a crime he committed as a teenager. His death, one of 13 federal executions carried out in the final months of Donald Trump's presidency, became one of the most controversial cases in modern history. Was he a cold-blooded accomplice, deserving of the ultimate punishment, or a reformed man whose life could have served a greater purpose? This isn't just a story about crime and punishment. It's a tale of deep remorse, redemption, and a justice system that leaves little room for mercy. It's also about the victims, their pain, their families, and the pursuit of closure. And the bigger question? What role did politics, public opinion, and the relentless push for federal executions under Trump play in sealing Brandon Bernard's fate? Stay with us as we uncover the chilling details of the crime, the emotional testimonies of those involved, and the protests that captured the world's attention. This is a story that will make you question everything you thought you knew about justice. And trust me, you won't believe how it all unfolds. In the summer of 1999, Todd and Stacey Bagley were living a life full of hope and devotion. A young Christian couple deeply rooted in their faith. They spent their time spreading kindness and love wherever they went. That day, they were on a mission trip in Killeen, Texas, sharing their faith and offering support to those in need. They had no idea their goodwill would lead them into the path of unimaginable danger. It started as an ordinary day. While heading home, they were approached by a group of teens asking for a ride. Among them was 18-year-old Brandon Bernard. Todd and Stacey, as they often did, agreed to help, seeing it as another opportunity to extend their kindness. But the teens had a different plan, a plan that would quickly spiral out of control. Once inside the car, the situation turned grim. The teens, led by 19-year-old Christopher Villalva, pulled a gun on the couple, turning what had started as a kind act into a terrifying ordeal. The Bagleys were forced into the trunk of their car, their faith and bravery put to the ultimate test as they prayed and sang hymns, holding on to each other for comfort. Meanwhile, the teens debated their next move, each decision pushing them further down a dark path. As the hours passed, Todd and Stacey remained locked in the trunk, while the group of teens drove around aimlessly, making failed attempts to withdraw money using the Bagleys' ATM card. The situation escalated when Villalva made a chilling decision. He would kill the couple. Despite the chaos around him, Brandon Bernard's role remained secondary. He was instructed to help set the stage for the crime that was about to unfold. What happened next was horrifying. The teens drove to a secluded area on the Fort Hood military reservation. There, Villalva shot both Todd and Stacey in the head. Todd died instantly, but Stacey survived the gunshot, unconscious but still alive. In the moments that followed, Bernard poured lighter fluid into the car, setting it ablaze under Villalva's orders. The fire consumed the car, tragically killing Stacey. That act, though not premeditated by Bernard, sealed his fate in the eyes of the law. He became an accomplice in one of the most brutal crimes Killeen had ever seen. The aftermath of the crime sent shockwaves through the community. The Bagleys' friends and family were left devastated, struggling to comprehend how such a senseless act could take the lives of 2 people who had only ever wanted to help others. For the teens involved, the fallout was swift. They were arrested, tried, and convicted in federal court, given the crime had occurred on military property. Bernard's defense argued that his role was minimal, that he was a follower, not the mastermind. But the prosecution painted a different picture, emphasizing his participation in the final act that took Stacey's life. The jury's decision was unanimous. Brandon Bernard, along with Christopher Villalva, would face the death penalty. For Bernard, the journey to that point had been shaped by poor decisions, peer pressure, and a series of events he could no longer escape. The trial ended, but the scars of that day remained, etched into the hearts of the Bagleys' loved ones in the community. People wanted answers. How could teens so young commit such a heinous act? And what role did society play in shaping their paths? The story of Brandon Bernard was only beginning to unfold. Brandon Bernard wasn't a hardened criminal. In fact, his upbringing was strikingly ordinary, marked by moments of joy and hardship like many others. Born into a military family, he moved frequently, never staying in one place long enough to form deep roots. This constant upheaval left him vulnerable, searching for a sense of belonging in a world that often felt unstable. By the time he reached adolescence, Bernard's life had taken a difficult turn. He struggled in school, found himself drawn to the wrong crowd, and began acting out, seeking approval from peers who often encouraged bad decisions. Like many teenagers, he was impressionable, eager to fit in, and desperate to find his place. But his choices led him down a dangerous path, one that would have devastating consequences. On that fateful day in June 1999, Bernard was 18 years old, legally an adult but emotionally still a boy trying to navigate his way through life. The group he had fallen in with wasn't just any group. They were young, troubled, and reckless, with a penchant for pushing boundaries. Bernard wasn't the leader. That role belonged to Christopher Villalva, who was older, more assertive, and deeply troubled himself. Bernard often followed along, too timid or unsure to push back. When the plan to carjack Todd and Stacy Bagley was hatched, Bernard likely didn't grasp the full gravity of what was about to happen. He went along, caught up in the momentum of the group. But as the crime unfolded and Villalva's plans turned more sinister, Bernard found himself deeper in a nightmare he couldn't escape. His role in setting the fire would haunt him forever. But at the time, he claimed he was acting out of fear and under pressure from Villalva. The media at the time painted Bernard and the others as cold-blooded killers, giving little attention to the complexities of their lives or the pressures that led to their decisions. But beneath the surface, there was a teenager who had made a terrible mistake, one that would cost him everything. As Bernard faced trial, the question loomed: was he a dangerous criminal or a young man who had made the worst decision of his life under duress? The answers to those questions would divide a nation, drawing attention to the flaws in the justice system, the role of peer influence, and the consequences of actions taken in the heat of the moment. Bernard's case became a flashpoint, raising questions about whether someone so young could ever fully comprehend the weight of their choices. The Bagley case was a test of the justice system, and as Brandon Bernard's trial unfolded, it became clear that this was no ordinary prosecution. The crime itself was undeniably horrific. 2 innocent people kidnapped, shot, and then burned alive. The jury, faced with the weight of this evidence, was asked to deliver not just a verdict, but a punishment that would shape the rest of Bernard's life, and perhaps set a precedent for how young offenders were treated in federal court. Prosecutors wasted no time building their case. They focused on Bernard's role in setting the fire that ultimately ended Stacy Bagley's life, portraying him as a willing accomplice rather than a scared teenager following orders. To them, Bernard wasn't just a bystander. He had actively participated in the crime. His defense team, however, painted a different picture, arguing that Bernard had been under the influence of Christopher Villalva, the group's dominant leader. They emphasized Bernard's youth, his lack of prior criminal history, and the peer pressure that had pushed him into such a catastrophic decision. But the court's view of the crime left little room for nuance. The federal death penalty, which had been dormant for years, came roaring back to life in cases like Bernard's. The prosecution leaned heavily on the emotional impact of the crime, calling witnesses who described the Bagleys' deep faith, their tragic final moments, and the devastating loss felt by their families and friends. Jurors were shown graphic evidence of the crime scene, and the weight of the victim's suffering loomed over every moment of the trial. In federal court, jurors must unanimously agree on the death penalty for it to be imposed. For Brandon Bernard, that agreement came swiftly. He was sentenced to death along with Christopher Villalva, who was executed in September 2020. The decision marked a stark moment in Bernard's life, from an 18-year-old boy who made a terrible mistake to a man facing the ultimate punishment. But as the years passed, questions began to surface about the fairness of his trial. Bernard's defense team had failed to introduce key mitigating evidence that could have influenced the jury's decision, such as testimony from experts on adolescent brain development or accounts of Bernard's positive behavior since his incarceration. The trial's outcome left a bitter taste for those who believed in the possibility of redemption, and it set the stage for the next chapter in Bernard's life, a journey of transformation that would captivate and divide the nation. In the cold, isolating confines of death row, Brandon Bernard began a journey of profound personal change. Locked away from the world, he had no choice but to confront the enormity of his actions. Unlike some inmates who grew bitter or resentful, Bernard took a different path, one of reflection, accountability, and ultimately redemption. The transformation wasn't immediate. At first, Bernard struggled to make sense of his situation. How had he gone from a confused teenager trying to fit into a man facing execution? Over time, he began to channel his energy into positive actions. He maintained a spotless disciplinary record, earning the respect of prison staff and fellow inmates alike. But Bernard's most notable impact came from his outreach efforts, where he worked to mentor young people at risk of making the same mistakes he had. Through letters, videos, and other forms of communication, Bernard spoke candidly about his past, using his story as a warning to others. He didn't shy away from the horrors of his crime or the pain he had caused the Bagley family. Instead, he took full responsibility, often expressing deep remorse for his actions. "I can never undo what I did," he wrote in one letter, "but I can try to prevent someone else from making the same choices." His actions didn't go unnoticed. Advocates for criminal justice reform began to take note of Bernard's story, using it as an example of why the death penalty should allow for considerations of rehabilitation and personal growth. They argued that Bernard's life behind bars had become one of service, and that taking it would serve no purpose beyond retribution. But as Bernard worked to better himself, the clock was ticking. Federal executions were rare, and for a time it seemed as though his sentence might never be carried out. Then in 2020, everything changed. Under Donald Trump's administration, the federal government resumed executions for the first time in nearly 2 decades, pushing through a series of high-profile cases in the final months of Trump's presidency. Bernard's name was on that list. The impending execution reignited debates about the death penalty and raised new questions about Bernard's case. If a man had spent 2 decades reforming himself, was it still just to execute him? Supporters of the death penalty argued that Bernard's actions, no matter how distant in time, still warranted the ultimate punishment. Others believed that his redemption was proof that people could change, and that his death would serve no greater good. For Bernard, the impending execution was a harsh reminder of the system's rigidity. Despite his best efforts to atone, he was still defined by a single moment in his youth, a moment that would ultimately seal his fate. As the world began to take notice of his story, Bernard's case became a symbol of everything that was right and wrong with the justice system, forcing America to reckon with the difficult questions surrounding crime, punishment, and the possibility of redemption. In 2020, Brandon Bernard's case took a dramatic turn as the Trump administration resumed federal executions after a 17-year pause. Under the direction of then-Attorney General William Barr, the Department of Justice began scheduling executions at an unprecedented pace. What made these executions even more controversial was the timing, amid a global pandemic, in the final months of Donald Trump's presidency, with many accusing the administration of using capital punishment as a political statement. Brandon Bernard's name was added to the list, along with 12 others who would face execution in a whirlwind of federal death penalty cases. The decision to execute Bernard came as a shock to many, not because of the crime he had committed, but because of who he had become over the 20 years he had spent on death row. Advocates argued that his spotless record, his rehabilitation, and his ongoing efforts to prevent at-risk youth from falling into crime should have been enough to at least grant him clemency. Yet the Trump administration showed no signs of leniency. For Trump and his supporters, the resumption of federal executions was framed as a matter of law and order, a demonstration of the administration's commitment to justice. In campaign speeches, Trump repeatedly emphasized his stance on being tough on crime, and the executions became a symbol of that resolve. But critics saw it differently. They argued that the rush to carry out executions before Trump left office ignored the complexities of these cases and the broader moral debates surrounding capital punishment. Bernard's case, in particular, stood out as a glaring example of the potential for injustice. What made Bernard's execution so controversial wasn't just the crime itself, it was the person he had become since. By 2020, Bernard had supporters from all walks of life, including former jurors, legal experts, and public figures who argued that his death sentence no longer reflected the principles of justice. Even one of the original prosecutors in his case publicly called for clemency, stating that Bernard's rehabilitation and remorse warranted mercy. Yet the Trump administration's approach to capital punishment left little room for such considerations. The timing of Bernard's execution only added to the outrage. As the nation was grappling with a pandemic and widespread political unrest, many questioned why the federal government was prioritizing executions. Protests erupted across the country, with activists holding signs that read, "Justice for Brandon" and "End the death penalty." Social media lit up with hashtags demanding clemency, and petitions garnered hundreds of thousands of signatures. The pressure on the Trump administration to halt Bernard's execution grew with each passing day. Despite the outcry, the administration pressed forward. For Bernard, the final weeks of his life were marked by a whirlwind of legal appeals, emotional pleas from supporters, and a growing sense of urgency among those fighting to save him. Yet as the execution date approached, it became clear that nothing would stop the machinery of the federal justice system. Brandon Bernard was set to die, and no amount of protests or public outcry seemed capable of changing that. For the Bagley family, the pain of losing Todd and Stacy had never truly faded. The couple, described by friends and family as deeply compassionate and unwaveringly kind, had been taken from them in the most horrific way imaginable. The crime left an indelible mark, not just on their loved ones but on the entire community. Over the years, the family struggled with the weight of their grief, navigating a world that suddenly felt emptier without Todd and Stacy in it. In the aftermath of the crime, the family initially found solace in the justice system's swift action. The arrests, the trial, and the sentences handed down to Brandon Bernard and Christopher Villalva provided a sense of closure, albeit incomplete. But as the years went on, the complexities of the case became harder to ignore. Bernard's rehabilitation, his outreach work, and the growing calls for clemency raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of justice and what it truly meant to honor Todd and Stacy's memory. Not all members of the Bagley family felt the same way about Bernard's execution. Some believed that the death penalty was the only appropriate punishment for the crime, a way to ensure that justice was served. Others, however, expressed ambivalence, grappling with the idea that taking Bernard's life wouldn't bring Todd and Stacy back. One family member, in a rare public statement, admitted feeling conflicted, saying, "What happened to Todd and Stacy was unforgivable, but I don't know if this is the answer." The Bagleys' legacy, however, wasn't defined by anger or vengeance. Friends and family remember Todd and Stacy as people who lived their lives guided by forgiveness and faith. It's a sentiment that made the debate around Bernard's execution all the more poignant. Advocates for clemency often pointed to the Bagleys' Christian values, suggesting that mercy would have been in line with their beliefs. But for the family, the loss was too profound to reduce to simple answers. As protests for Bernard gained traction, the Bagley story became a central focus of the media. News outlets revisited the crime, airing heartbreaking testimonies from the family and exploring the lasting impact of Todd and Stacy's deaths. Yet even as the family's pain was thrust back into the spotlight, the discourse often overlooked their humanity, reducing them to symbols in a larger political and moral debate. For those who knew the Bagleys, this was yet another painful chapter in a story they had been trying to heal from for over 2 decades. On the day of Bernard's execution, members of the Bagley family watched from a separate viewing room as justice, in its most irreversible form, was carried out. Some found solace in the finality of it, while others were left with lingering doubts about what had truly been accomplished. For them, the execution wasn't just an ending. It was a reminder of the tragedy that had stolen Todd and Stacy from their lives. The tension between the Bagley family's grief and the growing support for Bernard's clemency highlighted the complexity of the case. It wasn't just about crime and punishment. It was about humanity, forgiveness, and the limits of the justice system. And as the nation grappled with these questions, the Bagleys' story remained at the heart of a debate that would continue long after Bernard's final moments. As Brandon Bernard's execution date drew closer, the nation became captivated by his story. It wasn't just another death penalty case. It was a flashpoint in the ongoing debate over justice, redemption, and the morality of capital punishment. Protests erupted across the country, with activists, celebrities, and ordinary citizens taking to the streets and social media to demand clemency. The growing movement called into question not only Bernard's execution, but also the broader implications of resuming federal executions after nearly 2 decades. In the weeks leading up to his scheduled execution, high-profile figures like Kim Kardashian West amplified Bernard's story to millions of followers. She spoke passionately about his case, urging then-President Donald Trump to intervene. Her advocacy wasn't just about drawing attention. It was a direct plea to stop what she and many others saw as a grave injustice. She highlighted Bernard's rehabilitation, his deep remorse, and the overwhelming support from legal experts and former jurors who believed his life should be spared. Social media became a battleground. Hashtags like #NogginSaveBrandon and Justice for Brandon trended across platforms, and petitions calling for clemency gathered hundreds of thousands of signatures. People shared videos of Bernard speaking from death row, his calm and reflective demeanor striking a chord with those who watched. His words carried the weight of a man who had spent 2 decades grappling with the consequences of his actions, and his message resonated with a public increasingly critical of the death penalty. Protests weren't confined to social media. Demonstrators gathered outside federal courthouses, penitentiaries, and even the White House, holding signs with messages like "Rehabilitation over retribution" and "No justice in execution." Many of these protests were peaceful, though the intensity of emotion sometimes led to clashes with authorities. For those who participated, it wasn't just about Bernard. It was about fighting a system they believed was broken, one that disproportionately impacted young, marginalized people. The media played a significant role in fueling the conversation. News outlets published in-depth profiles of Bernard's life, his transformation behind bars, and the crime that had put him there. Some commentators questioned whether the federal government was using executions as a political tool, pointing to the unusual speed with which cases were being pushed forward under Trump's administration. Others defended the government's actions, arguing that Bernard's crime was so heinous that his rehabilitation, while admirable, couldn't erase the pain he had caused. The tension came to a head in the final days before the execution. Lawyers for Bernard filed multiple last-minute appeals, arguing that his original trial had been flawed and that new evidence suggested he played a less significant role in the crime than initially believed. One appeal even reached the Supreme Court, but the justices declined to intervene. Each rejected appeal brought Bernard one step closer to his fate, heightening the urgency of the protests and the desperation of his supporters. Despite the mounting pressure, President Trump remained silent. Many hoped he would step in, as he had the power to grant clemency with a single signature. But as the hours ticked by, it became clear that no such reprieve would come. For Bernard's supporters, the silence from the administration was deafening, a stark reminder of how little influence public opinion sometimes holds in the face of government power. On December 10, 2020, the day of Brandon Bernard's execution, the atmosphere was heavy with anticipation and sorrow. At the federal penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana, preparations were underway for what would be the 9th federal execution that year. Outside the prison, protesters gathered in the cold, their voices carrying a mix of anger and mourning. Some held signs bearing Bernard's name, others held candles in quiet vigil. The scene was a stark contrast to the sterile efficiency happening inside the prison walls. For Bernard, the hours leading up to his execution were a mix of reflection and farewell. He spent much of the day speaking with his legal team and writing letters to his family and supporters. He expressed deep remorse for the pain he had caused Todd and Stacey Bagley's family, acknowledging that no amount of apology could undo the harm he had done. At the same time, he thanked those who had fought for him, their efforts giving him strength in his final moments. When the time came, Bernard was escorted to the execution chamber, a somber procession witnessed by a small group of officials and members of the Bagley family. He was asked if he had any last words, and his response was as heartfelt as it was heartbreaking. He apologized once again to the Bagley's loved ones, expressing sorrow for the pain he had caused. He then turned his attention to his family and supporters, thanking them for their love and urging them to continue the fight for justice and mercy. The execution was carried out by lethal injection, and witnesses described the scene as heavy with emotion. Some in the room wept openly, others sat in stunned silence. For the Bagley family members present, the moment was a mix of closure and lingering sorrow. They had lost Todd and Stacy in a way that no one should ever have to endure. And while Bernard's execution marked the end of his life, it didn't erase the pain of their loss. Outside the prison, the reaction was swift and intense. Protesters erupted into chants of "Justice for Brandon," while others fell silent in mourning. Social media lit up with messages of grief, anger, and calls for change. Bernard's death was seen by many as a symbol of the flaws in the justice system. A man who had shown remorse and rehabilitation executed despite overwhelming public outcry. News of the execution dominated headlines. Some outlets focused on the protests and the emotional impact of Bernard's final words, while others highlighted the Bagley family's long wait for justice. Commentators debated the morality of the death penalty, particularly in cases involving young offenders and those who had demonstrated significant personal growth. Bernard's story became a rallying cry for those advocating for the abolition of capital punishment, sparking conversations that would continue long after his death. For Brandon Bernard, his final moments were marked by dignity and grace. For the nation, his execution was a moment of reckoning, a reminder of the complexities of justice, the weight of redemption, and the irreversible nature of the death penalty. As the prison lights dimmed and the protesters dispersed, one thing was clear. Bernard's story was far from over. It had become a symbol, a spark for change, and a call to action that would resonate for years to come. After Brandon Bernard's execution, the national conversation about the death penalty intensified. The story dominated news cycles for weeks, sparking debates not only about Bernard's case, but also about the broader implications of the federal government's return to capital punishment. Public opinion was deeply divided. For some, Bernard's death was a necessary act of justice, a consequence of his role in the tragic deaths of Todd and Stacy Bagley. For others, it was a glaring example of the justice system's failure to recognize redemption and rehabilitation. The media, which had already amplified the protests leading up to Bernard's execution, now turned its attention to the aftermath. Opinion pieces flooded major outlets, with the headlines like "Justice or Cruelty," "The Execution of Brandon Bernard," and "A Broken System: What the Bernard Case Tells Us About Capital Punishment." Experts on criminal justice, ethics, and law took to television and radio to discuss the case, each presenting their views on whether the execution had been justified. Social media became a forum for raw emotional reactions. Videos of protesters weeping outside the prison went viral, as did Bernard's final words, which were described by witnesses as both heartbreaking and deeply reflective. Supporters shared personal stories of redemption, using Bernard's case as a rallying cry for the abolition of the death penalty. Opponents of capital punishment pointed to the extraordinary outpouring of support Bernard had received, arguing that his life, though flawed, had value beyond the crime he committed. But the backlash wasn't universal. Voices defending Bernard's execution argued that the justice system had done its job, that his participation in such a horrific crime warranted the ultimate punishment regardless of his rehabilitation. For the Bagley family, the execution brought mixed emotions. Some members expressed relief, believing that the finality of Bernard's death brought a sense of closure. Others were more conflicted, struggling with the moral implications of taking another life, even in the name of justice. Brandon Bernard's execution also reignited discussions about race and systemic bias in the criminal justice system. Advocates highlighted how young black men like Bernard were disproportionately sentenced to death, often facing harsher punishments than their white counterparts for similar crimes. Bernard's case became a symbol for the broader fight against systemic racism, with activists linking his story to larger issues of inequality in sentencing, policing, and incarceration. One of the most significant impacts of Bernard's case was the renewed focus on the federal death penalty. The unprecedented number of executions carried out under the Trump administration, 13 in 6 months, fueled debates about the morality of such a policy, especially in light of evidence suggesting that many on death row had experienced severe trauma, poverty, or systemic failures that shaped their lives. Bernard's story, with its elements of remorse and redemption, became the centerpiece of this debate, forcing Americans to grapple with difficult questions. Was the death penalty truly about justice, or was it about retribution? And could a system that offered no second chances ever be called fair? As the months passed, Bernard's name became synonymous with the fight for change. His story inspired marches, rallies, and advocacy campaigns aimed at ending capital punishment once and for all. For those who believed in his potential for redemption, his death was a tragic reminder of the justice system's inflexibility. For others, it was a sobering lesson about the cost of crime and the weight of decisions made in moments of youthful recklessness. Brandon Bernard's execution wasn't just the end of a life, it was the beginning of a movement. In the months and years that followed, his story became a catalyst for change, sparking new conversations and actions aimed at reforming the criminal justice system. Activists, lawmakers, and ordinary citizens rallied around his memory, using his case as a symbol of what needed to change. One of the most immediate impacts was the introduction of legislation aimed at limiting or abolishing the federal death penalty. Lawmakers pointed to Bernard's case as an example of how the system could fail, arguing that it was time to reconsider whether capital punishment had any place in a modern justice system. These efforts faced fierce opposition from death penalty proponents, but the momentum was undeniable. Bernard's story had reignited a debate that many thought had grown dormant. Educational programs also sprang up in Bernard's honor, aimed at addressing the root causes of crime and providing support for at-risk youth. Advocates used Bernard's life as a cautionary tale, highlighting the dangers of peer pressure, the consequences of poor decisions, and the importance of providing young people with the resources they need to succeed. These programs became part of Bernard's legacy, ensuring that his story would continue to influence lives long after his death. The Bagley family, too, found themselves navigating a complicated legacy. While some members remained steadfast in their belief that justice had been served, others began to reflect on the broader implications of the case. In interviews and public statements, they spoke about their faith, their love for Todd and Stacy, and their hopes that something positive could come from such a devastating tragedy. Their voices added a layer of complexity to the public's understanding of the case, reminding everyone that justice is never simple and that the pain of loss is never easily healed. Perhaps the most powerful aspect of Bernard's legacy was the way it humanized the death penalty debate. His story wasn't just about numbers, policies, or abstract concepts. It was about a real person, with a life that was as flawed and complex as anyone else's. His transformation over 2 decades on death row forced people to confront the possibility of redemption, even for those who had committed terrible crimes. It challenged the notion that the worst thing someone has done should define them forever. Brandon Bernard's story also left a mark on those who had fought for him. Activists, lawyers, and supporters who had worked tirelessly to save his life found renewed purpose in their efforts to prevent similar cases in the future. His legal team, though devastated by the outcome, vowed to continue fighting for reform, using Bernard's case as a rallying cry for change. In the end, Bernard's story became more than just a single case. It became a symbol of the ongoing struggle for justice, fairness, and humanity in the criminal justice system. His life and death raised questions that will continue to resonate for years to come. Can a system that values punishment over rehabilitation ever be truly just? And what does it mean to offer mercy in a world so often defined by its absence? As the years passed, Brandon Bernard's name remained a touchstone for those fighting to make the world a more compassionate and equitable place. His story reminded people of the power of redemption, the importance of second chances, and the profound impact of a life, even one cut tragically short. And in that sense, Brandon Bernard's legacy became something far greater than the crime that defined his youth. It became a call to action for a better, fairer future.